When a sudden electric fault ripped open the old palace wall, no one expected history to breathe again. But as the dust settled, a hidden panel slowly slid apart, revealing a forgotten crown pulsing with an eerie golden glow. The Queen's lost legacy wasn't just intact, it was awakening. The courtyard was silent, yet the palace seemed to hum with memory, the echoes of centuries lingering like a half-remembered chant. Yesterday's commands, now buried in marble and shadow, still resonated faintly beneath the polished floors. Somewhere beyond the grand arches, deep in the labyrinth of the palace's forgotten wings, a subtle anomaly stirred, a soft electrical quiver, too faint for most to notice, yet undeniable to those attuned to the palace's pulse. The camera drifts past ancestral portraits whose eyes gleam in the low torchlight. Each gaze seems to weigh the passage of time, silently recording the comings and goings of servants, guards, and historians. Dust motes swirl in the air, caught in the ghostly gleam of a sudden golden light emerging from a wall panel long left untouched. It is not a flash, not a blaze, but a delicate pulse, faint, insistent, almost deliberate. A young historian, tasked with cataloguing relics and artifacts long thought irrelevant, rounds the corner. Ink-stained fingers clutch parchment. Eyes, accustomed to dim candlelight, widen at the sight before him. The wall panel, ordinary and ignored for decades, now glows as if it contains the breath of the palace itself. Slowly, reverently, he approaches, feeling the weight of his duty press against his chest. Every step echoes faintly on marble floors, each sound amplified in the quiet, as if the palace were listening. The golden light grows warmer, richer, reflecting off the brass plaques and coats of arms lining the walls. The historian's pulse quickens. Then, amid the flickering, he sees it, the Queen's crown. Once thought lost to history, it rests behind the wall in a hidden alcove, the gemstones shimmering as if remembering sunlight long forgotten. There is no mistaking it, the crown radiates a presence, a tangible aura that transcends mere metal and jewel. He hesitates. To touch it would violate a legacy centuries in the making. To look away feels almost sacrilegious. Awe and fear intertwine like shadows in the corners of the room. The crown's light pulses rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and the historian feels a strange alignment of time and duty, as if the past and present have converged in this quiet, hidden chamber. From somewhere deeper in the palace, a low, metallic hum grows louder, mingling with the soft crackle of the palace's aging electrical system. The historian senses movement beyond the room, polished boots on marble floors, whispers of authority threaded with caution. Guards appear at the threshold, their trained eyes scanning the room, not just for intruders, but for anomalies that might disrupt centuries of order. One guard, braver than the others, steps forward, hand hovering near the lighted panel. "Sir, should we?" The question falters, swallowed by the thick, reverent silence. The historian shakes his head ever so slightly, a quiet plea to honor protocol, to preserve what centuries have protected. The guard hesitates, caught between obedience and instinct, the golden glow reflecting in his eyes like fire in still water. The historian crouches near the panel, careful not to disturb the dust that has lain untouched for decades. He traces the engraved crests along the wall, each symbol a silent sentinel guarding stories of loyalty, betrayal, and unspoken duty. The golden light intensifies, brushing across the ornate stonework and highlighting centuries of careful craftsmanship. It is more than illumination, it is revelation. Time stretches, dust falls in slow motion through the beams of the pulsing light. The historian feels the weight of the palace's memory pressing down upon him. The room itself seems alive, the air thick with anticipation. Somewhere in the distance, a shadow moves silently along the corridors. The historian does not see it, but he senses it, a presence aware of the crown's rediscovery, measuring, waiting. He exhales slowly, the sound loud in the stillness. The crown is no longer just a relic. It is a summons, a test of vigilance and conscience. Questions press upon him. Why was it hidden? Who decreed it lost? And above all, what will befall those who dared to rediscover it? The glow seems to pulse in answer, a quiet, unspoken warning that some secrets are never meant to be unveiled without consequence. The camera pans over the room, brass plaques, engraved crests, and ancestral portraits, bathed in golden light. Each artifact whispers a fragment of history, and the crown stands at the center, not merely as a piece of ornamentation, but as a beacon of legacy, power, and moral obligation. The historian's reflection glimmers in the gold, a subtle reminder that in this moment he is both observer and participant. Footsteps grow nearer. The guard's whispers mix with the soft hum of electricity, a fragile harmony of vigilance and awe. One mutters, "It's impossible." The historian does not answer, aware that words would cheapen the gravity of the discovery. Instead, he takes careful notes, cataloguing impressions, the subtle pulse of the crown, the way the light moves across time, worn stone. He records everything, knowing this moment may be remembered or erased, depending on the whims of duty and protocol. A soft draft brushes the room, stirring dust and lifting candle flames in the corners. Shadows stretch, bending around the glowing crown, merging into shapes the mind struggles to identify. The historian feels the pull of curiosity, yet the weight of responsibility holds him in place. There is a thin line between discovery and transgression, and the crown pulses insistently, reminding him of that boundary. And then, a faint, deliberate movement in the corridor beyond. A shadowed figure halts motionless, as though sensing the crown's awakening. The historian notices the chill that follows the figure's presence, a subtle warning that history has eyes, even when unseen. Secrets buried for centuries stir quietly, whispering that this discovery will not remain contained. The room grows still again, yet the pulse of the crown reverberates through stone and air alike. The historian swallows, acutely aware that the palace itself seems to hold its breath. History is no longer passive. It has awakened. The golden glow intensifies, casting long shadows across the marble and brass. In the corridors beyond, the shadowed figure moves silently, aware that the crown has been found. Questions of duty, curiosity, and consequence are already beginning to stir, and the historian senses that nothing in the palace will remain the same. The glow of the crown seemed to breathe now, pulsing with an almost conscious rhythm. The historian crouched closer, careful not to break the invisible bond of ritual and secrecy surrounding the hidden relic. Each pulse reflected on the brass plaques and the crests embedded in the walls, shimmering across generations of monarchs who had long since faded into memory. For a fleeting moment, the historian could almost hear their silent counsel, urging caution and discretion. A draft stirred the dust, lifting tiny motes into the halo of golden light. The shadows around him lengthened, bending unnaturally along the stone floor. Somewhere behind the walls, the palace's ancient foundations groaned, as if acknowledging that a boundary had been crossed. The historian's breath caught. The crown was no longer simply a forgotten artifact. It was a fulcrum, balancing curiosity against the weight of centuries of authority. Footsteps approached, deliberate and measured. The guards, their eyes trained to detect anomalies, flanked the corridor with rigid precision. One of them whispered to another, "It's real." The historian, careful to make no sudden movement, nodded ever so slightly, his heart hammering in sync with the crown's rhythmic pulse. The golden light danced across the historian's face, illuminating the awe and fear etched into his features. He glanced toward the shadowed corridor where movement had stirred moments before. The figure had not advanced. Instead, it lingered just beyond reach, a silent observer. The historian realized the crown's rediscovery was not an isolated event. It had awakened attention in the corridors and chambers of the palace, long thought empty. Tentatively, the historian reached for his notebook, the quill scratching softly across parchment as he catalogued the crown's glow. Its aura, the strange warmth that seemed to radiate from the metal itself. Each notation carried with it a sense of reverence, yet beneath it, a subtle unease. What had been hidden, and why, had become questions that demanded answers, and answers in this palace were rarely simple. A faint click echoed from behind the wall panel. The crown shivered in response, the gemstones reflecting fractured light. The historian froze. The panel, previously sealed and inert for centuries, had reacted. It was a signal, deliberate or coincidental, he could not tell. The pulse of the crown quickened, casting long, trembling shadows across the floor. The palace itself seemed to lean in, listening, waiting for what might follow. The guards exchanged tense glances. One reached toward the panel, and instinctively the historian placed a hand on his arm. "Do not," he whispered, voice tight with caution. The guard hesitated, unsure whether he had heard command or caution, the tension thick in the air. The golden light cast strange shapes across the walls, turning familiar crests into unfamiliar, almost threatening visages. Then came the sound, a low murmur, so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind. The historian's head snapped toward it. Behind a distant archway, the shadowed figure now stepped forward, a measured gait betraying certainty and purpose. It was no servant, no guard, but someone who knew the palace intimately, someone whose knowledge of the crown and its concealment ran deep. The historian's thoughts raced. Who could move unseen in the palace corridors, aware of a crown that had been lost to memory? Questions collided with protocol. Every instinct screamed caution, yet the human desire to witness history unfold burned just as fiercely. The golden glow reflected in his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, curiosity outweighed fear. As he moved to take a closer look, the crown's pulse seemed to intensify, almost as if warning him to stop. He paused, sensing the fragile line he was about to cross. The room seemed suspended in time, the glow of the crown, the silence of the palace, the presence of the shadowed figure. Every element conspired to heighten the historian's awareness, forcing him to consider the consequences of his next action. Suddenly, the crown's light flared, a brief, radiant burst that illuminated the entire chamber. Dust motes twirled like golden fireflies, and the inscriptions on the walls became momentarily legible, names of monarchs, dates of reign, and hints of lost ceremonies. The historian blinked, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. The palace had revealed a fragment of its hidden memory, and it had done so in a language older than words, speaking directly to those present. A guard exhaled audibly, breaking the silence, but the historian did not turn. He could feel the weight of eyes upon him, the unseen figure, the silent guardians of tradition, and the centuries of protocol that insisted on respect. The glow began to stabilize, returning to its gentle, insistent rhythm. The pulse was steady now, like a heartbeat measured against the historian's own. He knew that nothing here was accidental. The crown had been hidden for a reason, and its rediscovery would ripple far beyond this small chamber. A sense of moral tension gripped him, the responsibility of knowledge, the temptation of curiosity, and the undeniable duty to honor centuries of palace secrecy. The historian's hand hovered over the panel, trembling. He dared not touch, yet dared not look away. The shadowed figure now retreated silently, melting back into the corridors, leaving only the historian, the guards, and the pulsing crown. In that moment, the historian understood that the palace itself had orchestrated this discovery. It was not merely an artifact to be catalogued. It was a test, a reminder that the past and present coexist in delicate balance, and that the consequences of rediscovery are never predictable. The golden light slowly softened, bathing the room in a quiet, steady glow. The historian exhaled, lowering himself to a crouch. Every object around him, the plaques, the crests, the walls, seemed to hold their breath, aware that history had been nudged into motion. He realized that this moment was not simply the rediscovery of a crown, but the awakening of questions, responsibilities, and moral dilemmas that would reverberate through the palace long after the light faded. As he straightened, the camera pans upward to the crown, radiant in its alcove, and then slowly down the corridor where shadows linger. Somewhere beyond, the palace waits, patient and deliberate. The historian steps back, leaving space between himself and the crown, understanding that some secrets require distance to preserve their power. The room exhales along with him, a quiet acknowledgement of the fragile balance restored for now. The crown's pulse lingers, golden and insistent. In the quiet corridors, a shadowed figure watches from beyond the walls, aware that the crown has been found. The historian now carries a secret that will test protocol, loyalty, and conscience, a secret that will soon demand answers in the heart of the palace bureaucracy. What follows will challenge tradition, reveal hidden truths, and force those bound by duty to confront their own moral choices. The corridors were quieter now, but the golden pulse of the crown still lingered in the historian's mind. The events of the previous night clung to him like a shadow, insistent and impossible to shake. Every footstep echoed differently now. The palace, vast and silent, seemed to observe him, weighing his actions against centuries of precedent. The glow had faded from view, yet its memory remained, a reminder that discovery always carries consequence. He began methodically, as he had been trained, moving to the archives with careful deliberation. Scrolls lay neatly on worn oak tables, dust and candle wax forming a fragile bridge between past and present. Each parchment, each bound ledger, offered the historian a fragment of understanding protocols, ceremonial handbooks, security logs, and meticulously kept inventories. The crown, he realized, had been deliberately hidden, erased from collective memory, and yet its presence was now undeniable. As he opened the first scroll, the camera drifts across the room, catching glimpses of gilded handles, iron clasps, and seals stamped with the royal crest. He reads aloud softly, the words barely audible in the cavernous room, records of a disputed succession, a crown deliberately removed from ceremonial use, a secrecy reinforced by generations of stewards. Each entry reveals meticulous care. The palace had protected the crown not only physically, but legally, morally, and ceremonially. The historian's pen scratches across parchment, cataloguing every detail. Notes are taken on the light's effect, on the surrounding architecture, on the inscriptions embedded in the walls near the hidden alcove, on patterns that may indicate the crown's historical concealment. Even the dust seems to tell a story. Centuries of careful neglect, of intentional omission, of silence maintained at all costs. He pauses, realizing the depth of the palace's bureaucracy. Access to the crown is not merely a matter of physical keys. It is a lattice of authority, protocol, and ceremonial tradition. Every steward, every guard, every clerk holds a fragment of responsibility, and missteps are remembered. To document the crown is to navigate a labyrinth of authority, each turn more delicate than the last. Footsteps approach, deliberate and measured. A senior steward appears, eyes narrowing as they take in the historian's careful work. You understand, the steward intones, voice low but firm, that this is not simply an artifact. It is a symbol, and symbols are enforceable by law, tradition, and protocol. The historian nods, aware that he is not only cataloguing history, but also stepping into its living governance. He is escorted to a smaller, more secure chamber, where archival logs are kept in triplicate, protected by both lock and ritual. Here, the historian pores over entries detailing the crown's concealment. Ceremonial instructions are precise. The crown may only be viewed by authorized personnel, its location communicated through secure channels, its light not to be observed without supervision. The historian notes the contradictions. A crown meant to inspire awe has been deliberately hidden, its radiance forbidden to all but a select few. Hours pass. Candle flames gutter and flicker as he sifts through the records. Each interaction with palace staff reinforces the rigid hierarchy. The electricians responsible for the building's electrical systems cannot touch the crown. The secretarial aides cannot relay its location, and the guards can only report anomalies without comment. The historian realizes that the palace itself enforces silence, as much a guardian of morality as of gold. And yet, the crown's rediscovery introduces uncertainty. Logs from previous centuries hint at disputes, succession disagreements, ceremonial breaches, and at least one near riot over access to the hidden chamber. The historian begins to see a pattern. The palace maintains its authority not merely through rules, but through controlled absence, deliberate erasure, and the moral weight of secrecy. A subtle alarm interrupts his work. A note slipped under the chamber door, unsigned. It warns simply, "Do not proceed without authorization." The historian freezes, the words stark against the candlelit walls. The crown, hidden yet pulsing in his memory, is no longer a relic to be documented alone. Its rediscovery has already stirred the hierarchy. Every protocol now matters more than ever, and every action is observed, even when unseen. He leans back in his chair, considering the weight of responsibility. Curiosity fights against prudence. To continue his work is to risk reprisal. To halt is to risk the loss of knowledge. The palace, with all its silent corridors, has become a crucible. He is tested not only in skill and diligence, but in judgment, conscience, and moral courage. A soft sound interrupts him, the distant echo of a footstep on polished marble, slow and deliberate. The historian's gaze lifts to the corridor beyond. A shadow passes briefly, vanishing into the recesses of the palace. The subtle tension returns. The rediscovery of the crown has awakened not only interest but scrutiny, and someone, somewhere, is aware of its light. He returns to his documentation, meticulously recording every observation, every pulse of memory recalled by the crown's illumination. Security logs show unusual activity, minor breaches of routine, unexplained electrical fluctuations, nothing overt, yet enough to indicate that the palace itself has shifted in response. Every record carries dual weight, factual accuracy, and ceremonial consequence. By evening, the historian realizes that he has entered a network far more complex than he anticipated. Archival scrolls, ceremonial handbooks, and security logs are not isolated documents. They are interwoven safeguards, a lattice of knowledge and authority protecting a crown that was never meant to be found. The glowing memory of the crown now guides him, shaping his decisions, sharpening his awareness of loyalty, protocol, and moral duty. The golden pulse of recollection fills the room, faint yet insistent, as though the crown itself is aware of his scrutiny. The historian pauses, hand hovering over a ledger detailing centuries, old rules of succession. Each phrase, each marginal note, carries the weight of lives lived under the monarchy's gaze. He senses that the palace, silent and disciplined, is testing him. Can curiosity coexist with obedience? Can knowledge survive without compromise? In the dim candlelight, He begins mapping the crown's rediscovery against layers of bureaucracy. Each steward, guard, and aide is a node in a network of control, each action measured against centuries of precedent. He understands now that the crown's light is both revelation and challenge. Its rediscovery will test every protocol, every rule, and every moral compass within the palace. The historian straightens, leaning over the records one last time for the night. Outside, the corridors remain quiet, but the shadow of observation lingers, subtle and unyielding. He knows that even as he records, even as he documents, the palace is watching, and so is the crown. Its glow may be hidden now, but its consequences are already beginning to unfold. A minor breach in protocol, an unauthorized hand reaching toward the crown flickers in the logs. The historian senses the first tremors of conflict, a quiet warning that curiosity and duty may soon collide. The palace waits, silent yet watchful, as the historian prepares to navigate layers of authority, hierarchy, and moral responsibility that will challenge him in ways he cannot yet foresee. The chamber was dim now, lit only by the faint glow of candlelight reflecting off polished brass and ink-stained parchment. The historian's fingers hovered over a ledger, tracing carefully the centuries, old notation of ceremonial codes, the precise instructions regarding the Queen's hidden crown. Each phrase carried the weight of generations, a lattice of authority, secrecy, and moral obligation, and each step he took felt like a negotiation with history itself. Then, almost imperceptibly, the temperature shifted. A cold draught brushed past his shoulder, carrying the faint whisper of movement from the corridor outside. He paused, heart thudding, as the palace's quiet rhythm footfalls, murmurs, the hum of unseen electricity seemed to quicken in response to an unseen observer. The shadowed figure from before lingered just beyond reach, invisible but palpably present, a silent sentinel watching the historian's every move. He turned back to the ledger, but the words seemed heavier now. Marginal notes written in fading ink hinted at tensions long forgotten. Disputes over succession, ceremonial breaches, and even accusations of betrayal tied to the crown's concealment. Each entry reminded him that the palace is not merely stone and parchment, it is a living institution, a web of authority and loyalty, and every infraction, no matter how minor, reverberates across time. A soft creak signaled another approach. A palace steward stepped into the chamber, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a firm line. "You are aware," the steward said quietly, "that even observation carries responsibility. Some knowledge demands restraint." His gaze flicked toward the hidden alcove, unspoken yet unmistakable. The historian nodded, aware that he was navigating a maze of protocol, a delicate balance of curiosity, duty, and moral caution. Minutes stretched into hours. Candle flames flickered and guttered, casting restless shadows across the walls. The historian meticulously documented every detail, the crown's illumination, the placement of protective panels, the subtle distortions of light on the surrounding crests. Each note, each observation, was a thread in a tapestry that spanned centuries, connecting past caretakers to the present moment. And yet, despite his care, the first breach occurred. An aide, overzealous or careless, extended a hand toward the hidden alcove, brushing the edge of the panel. Instantly, the historian's heart caught. The crown's glow responded subtly, a flicker, almost like a shiver, as if aware of the intrusion. Protocol had been broken, even momentarily, and the palace seemed to tighten around them, enforcing silence and consequence in equal measure. "Stop!" the historian whispered sharply, placing a steadying hand on the aide's arm. The gesture was both protective and corrective, a reminder that the crown's rediscovery is not only a matter of curiosity, but of moral responsibility. The aide froze, shame and fear mingling in the flickering candlelight. The room, thick with tension, seemed to absorb every heartbeat, every tremor of conscience. The senior steward stepped closer, voice calm but authoritative. "Do you understand the significance of this breach?" He paused, letting the weight of centuries hang in the air. "Even the smallest infraction can unsettle the balance of tradition, trust, and duty. The crown is not merely an object, it is a living testament to our history, and to honor it is to honor every hand that has preserved it in silence." The historian nodded, pen poised but untouched, acutely aware that his next actions must navigate the line between diligence and transgression. Every observation, every note, must serve both truth and protocol. The palace had taught him this lesson through silence, shadow, and centuries of meticulous documentation. Outside, the corridors remained still, but the sense of observation lingered. The shadowed figure, unseen but undeniably present, seemed to mark every movement. The historian realized that rediscovery had awakened more than curiosity. It had stirred vigilance, suspicion, and the latent power dynamics of the palace hierarchy. Each participant, even passive observers, now played a role in the unfolding moral calculus. Hours later, the historian returned to the hidden alcove, notebook in hand. He examined the panel, tracing the engravings along its edges, noting how the golden light once pulsed when the unauthorized hand approached. The crown's rediscovery was no accident. The palace had allowed it to awaken, deliberately or not, and now the historian had become both custodian and witness. He paused, considering the implications. The crown's light had stirred the bureaucracy, revealing both the strength and fragility of centuries, old protocols. The palace, with its meticulous records and hierarchy, demanded obedience, but curiosity and conscience demanded inquiry. The historian understood now that knowledge is never neutral, it is intertwined with power, loyalty, and moral responsibility. As the evening deepened, the palace quieted, but tension remained. Minor alarms in the security logs hinted at unseen movement, irregular access, subtle disruptions in electrical patterns, small deviations that could signify a test, a warning, or something more. The historian documented them all, recognizing that every detail could prove critical, not merely for understanding the crown, but for navigating the intricate web of authority surrounding it. Finally, he straightened, hands clasping the notebook tightly. He had catalogued centuries of secrecy, documented the crown's illumination, and observed the first stirrings of protocol breaches. But the palace had not yet revealed its full measure. The glow of the crown, though hidden, still lingered in memory, a silent reminder that discovery is only the beginning. The real challenge, he understood, would come when tradition, curiosity, and conscience collided. A single, unauthorized hand had brushed against the crown's alcove. That brief touch had awakened more than curiosity, it had alerted the palace hierarchy and set into motion a confrontation that would test loyalty, ambition, and moral courage. What followed next would force those bound by centuries of protocol to confront their own conscience. As the shadow of the crown's rediscovery reached into the heart of power, the palace had grown quieter in the hours after the crown's rediscovery, yet every corridor seemed to hum with anticipation. Shadows pooled in corners where torchlight dared not linger, and the faint memory of golden illumination lingered in the minds of those who had seen it. The historian moved carefully through the corridors, notebook in hand, aware that every footstep, every whispered breath could be observed. The weight of centuries pressed down upon him, and he was not alone in sensing it. Inside the administrative wing, palace officials gathered in hushed consultation. Their voices were measured, careful, as if the walls themselves might carry sound to ears unseen. Protocol, hierarchy, and personal ambition intertwined in tense equilibrium. A minor breach, recorded in logs and whispered rumors, had set the palace machinery in motion. Each steward, guard, and secretary understood the unspoken rule. The crown's rediscovery was not simply an event. It was a test of loyalty, vigilance, and discretion. The historian approached a chamber where the senior stewards convened. Candlelight flickered across polished oak tables, stacked with ledgers, ceremonial guides, and security logs. The tension was almost tangible, a living entity that seemed to press against the walls. One of the senior advisors glanced at him sharply. "You have seen it," he said, voice quiet but firm, "and yet you are bound to observe, not act. Are you prepared for the responsibility that entails?" The historian nodded, aware that knowledge alone is a burden, and observation carries consequences as severe as action. The camera drifts slowly across the room, lingering on the subtle expressions of unease and calculation etched on the officials' faces. Some were wary, loyal to the preservation of tradition above all else. Others bore a glint of ambition, a curiosity about what rediscovery might offer if leveraged carefully. The crown's glow, though hidden from view, had already begun to illuminate divisions, fractures long suppressed by decorum and habit. Footsteps echoed sharply in the corridor beyond. The historian and the officials looked toward the source, instinctively tense. The doors opened and the queen herself entered. Her presence commanded immediate silence. Every gesture, every glance carried authority unspoken yet absolute. The room seemed to shrink, drawn taut with respect, fear, and awe. The crown, though physically hidden, pulsed invisibly in the minds of all present, a reminder of power both tangible and symbolic. "Report," the queen said softly, yet each word resonated with finality. The senior advisor bowed slightly, recounting the sequence of events: the historian's discovery, the minor breach, the glowing pulse of the crown, and the documentation undertaken to date. Each detail was precise, rehearsed yet laced with tension, for reporting the truth in the palace is an act of courage as much as obedience. The historian stepped forward, offering his notes, careful to avoid embellishment, yet aware that the weight of his observations carried moral significance. The crown's illumination was deliberate, consistent, and responsive to minor disturbances. He said, "No one may approach without authorization, and yet it has awakened attention beyond expectation." His words hung in the room, heavy with unspoken consequence. The queen's gaze swept the assembly, resting momentarily on the historian. "Knowledge of the crown is not trivial," she said. "Its rediscovery can preserve history, or unravel it. Every action taken here must honor both duty and discretion." Her voice, though calm, carried a moral gravity that left no room for doubt. Loyalty and conscience would be tested, and judgment would be exacting. A murmur passed among the officials. The shadow of ambition was already stirring. Some saw opportunity, others recognized the peril. The crown, once hidden, had become a mirror reflecting both fear and desire. Each heartbeat of light illuminating not merely metal and jewels, but the very essence of those who served beneath it. Hours later, in a smaller, isolated chamber, the historian met with a senior advisor in quiet consultation. "You must understand," the advisor said, voice low and urgent. "This is more than rediscovery. The crown is a test of judgment. One misstep could compromise centuries of tradition, even imperil the monarchy itself." The historian nodded, absorbing both caution and moral weight. The room seemed to shrink, enclosing them in a space where conscience, duty, and ambition collided. The crown's pulse, though unseen, echoed in their minds, a constant reminder that observation alone does not absolve responsibility. The advisor continued, "You must balance transparency with restraint. Knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Curiosity unchecked can erode the very authority that protects what we preserve." Every word carved into the historian's conscience, a slow, deliberate shaping of moral tension. Meanwhile, behind the heavy doors of the palace archives, subtle movements were detected. Minor adjustments of security, whispered inquiries, and the quiet tracing of protocols by those whose loyalty had been tested by the crown's rediscovery. The palace had awoken in layers, each corridor, chamber, and ledger a node in a web of responsibility and vigilance. The historian felt the subtle pressure of history converging on him, aware that his next actions would ripple far beyond the room's candlelit walls. As the night deepened, the Queen departed, her presence leaving a residual gravity that seemed to settle over every corridor. The historian remained, surrounded by logs, scrolls, and ledgers, reflecting on the delicate tension he now navigated. The crown's rediscovery had ignited curiosity, authority, and moral obligation in equal measure. It had also exposed the fractures beneath centuries of protocol, hinting at confrontations that would soon demand resolution. A distant echo of footsteps reminded him that observation was never truly solitary. Somewhere in the shadowed halls, the palace was alive with anticipation, scrutiny, and silent calculation. Loyalties would be tested, motives revealed, and the historian's conscience, like that of every attendant, steward, and guard, would soon be drawn into the light of revelation. The Queen's unexpected presence has reinforced authority, but tensions simmer beneath the surface. Loyalties and motives remain hidden, and the minor breach of protocol threatens to escalate into confrontation. What follows will force choices between tradition, ambition, and conscience as the Crown, silent yet insistent, watches over every decision. The palace had grown almost oppressive with silence. The historian remained in the archive chamber, notes laid carefully across the table, the faint memory of the crown's golden pulse lingering in his mind. Yet outside, corridors seemed to hum with anticipation, every shadow a possible observer, every whisper a signal of unrest. The minor breach of protocol had already sent ripples through the palace hierarchy, and now curiosity, ambition, and duty coalesced in a silent tension that could no longer be contained. Then, without warning, the chamber doors opened. A senior steward entered, flanked by aides whose expressions betrayed both caution and eagerness. Their eyes flicked to the historian, then toward the alcove where the crown was concealed. The historian instinctively straightened, aware that the room itself seemed to tighten around them, every breath amplified by centuries of expectation and ritual. An unauthorized hand has approached the crown. The steward began, voice low but precise. It was minor, yet deliberate enough to demand attention. His gaze swept the historian's face, measuring judgment, caution, and comprehension. This is no longer a matter of documentation alone. The Crown's rediscovery has introduced variables we must address immediately. The historian nodded, realizing that observation alone could no longer suffice. The weight of history, protocol, and conscience pressed down upon him. Knowledge had become responsibility, and responsibility demanded action. The doors opened again, and a hush fell over the room. The Queen herself entered, her presence commanding a gravity that made even seasoned stewards pause. Candlelight flickered against her features, illuminating eyes that held both authority and quiet scrutiny. Every movement, every gesture, carried the weight of centuries, yet her steps were measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial in their precision. "Report," she said, and the room seemed to contract under the force of her voice. The senior advisor recounted events, discovery of the crown, minor breach, initial observations, and ongoing documentation. Each word resonated with moral and practical consequence. The historian stepped forward, offering his notes. "The crown's illumination responds to proximity," he said carefully. "No contact has occurred beyond the initial intrusion, but its presence has stirred awareness beyond expectation." The Queen's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on each observer. "The crown is not merely an artifact, she said softly, yet her tone carried unyielding authority. "It is a test of conscience, judgment, and loyalty. Every action, every choice carries weight. And yet, even in silence, some truths will demand confrontation." Tension thickened as subtle glances were exchanged among officials. Hidden motives surfaced in the quietest gestures, a flick of an eye, a tense shift of posture, the faintest quiver in a hand resting on parchment. The crown, though physically hidden, had become a mirror for ambition, fear, and the moral courage of those present. A sudden stir near the hidden alcove drew every gaze. One aide, unable to restrain curiosity, reached toward the concealed crown. The historian's hand shot out instinctively, stopping the movement. "Do not," he whispered, voice taut with caution. The room held its breath, the walls themselves seeming to lean in. The crown's light, remembered in their minds, pulsed almost audibly, a heartbeat echoing through centuries of duty. The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, sharp and discerning. "Curiosity is a necessary force," she said, "but it must be tempered with discipline. This moment, like every moment in our history, tests the measure of those who serve. Will you honor your duty, or will ambition guide your hand?" The moral tension was palpable. The historian felt the weight of every choice he had made, every observation, every note taken. The minor breach of protocol, the unseen shadow in the corridor, the lingering pulse of the crown, all were converging into a confrontation of conscience and authority. Minutes stretched, heavy with unspoken judgment. Then the Queen made her decision. She motioned to the stewards and aides. "The crown will be temporarily removed from public view," she commanded. "Its location secured, its illumination contained. Those responsible for its rediscovery will continue documentation, but with utmost restraint and discretion." A collective exhale filled the chamber. Relief and tension intermingled. Some faces softened, others remained taut with lingering anxiety. Loyalties were tested, hidden motives quietly assessed, and the historian understood that the moral stakes had not been resolved, only deferred. As the Queen departed, the candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the chamber walls. The historian lingered, hand resting on the notebook, aware that the crown's rediscovery had set in motion forces far beyond the archive. The palace, patient and deliberate, had responded with authority, yet the consequences of ambition, curiosity, and conscience would continue to unfold. Outside, the corridors seemed to hold their breath. The shadowed figure from before lingered just beyond sight, a reminder that observation, secrecy, and loyalty were threads woven into the fabric of palace life. The historian understood now that knowledge alone carries responsibility, and that every action in the palace is measured not just in protocol, but in moral consequence. The Queen's decision to remove the crown from public view has temporarily restored order, but loyalties remain fractured. Hidden motives linger, and moral tensions simmer beneath the surface. What follows will lead the historian and the palace into secret chambers, coded journals, and revelations that challenge both duty and conscience as shadows lengthen and the crown's secrets await in the marble vaults. The palace had returned to its semblance of order, yet an undercurrent of unease lingered in the corridors. Candles flickered against the polished marble, casting long shadows that seemed almost alive, whispering of secrets best left undisturbed. The crown had been removed from public view, its pulse of golden light hidden behind locked doors and layered protocol. But the historian, notebook in hand, knew that silence does not erase discovery. It only deepens the weight of memory. He moved through the quiet halls with deliberate care, aware that every step might be observed, every glance interpreted. The corridors stretched interminably, lined with ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow him, silently judging, silently remembering. Somewhere behind stone walls and heavy oak doors, secrets long buried stirred, waiting for the right eyes to uncover them. The historian approached the entrance to a marble vault, a chamber known only to a select few. Its doors were vast, carved with symbols of loyalty, duty, and governance, each crest a sentinel guarding layers of institutional memory. A faint chill emanated from the chamber, carrying the scent of aged parchment, wax, and polished stone. He paused at the threshold, hand resting lightly on the ornate handle. This was more than an archive. It was a repository of truth, of betrayals, loves, and moral compromise, preserved in secrecy for centuries. As he stepped inside, the air thickened with the weight of history. Candlelight danced across marble floors, illuminating shelves stacked with scrolls, bound ledgers, and meticulously catalogued artifacts. Each object seemed to hum with silent testimony letters detailing disputes over succession, decrees outlining moral obligations, and personal journals of those who had lived under the crown's shadow. The historian felt the gravity of his role. He was not merely observing, he was interpreting the conscience of a centuries-old institution. He moved carefully along the shelves, fingers brushing lightly against vellum and leather. Every scroll, every bound volume, carried coded knowledge. One letter, sealed in wax and yellowed with age, hinted at a betrayal that had rocked the monarchy generations ago, a dispute over inheritance and loyalty, carried out in whispers and shadowed corridors. Another journal, cryptic in its entries, hinted at a love affair that had endangered duty, leaving choices suspended between personal conscience and institutional survival. The camera pans slowly across the vault, capturing the historian's meticulous movements. Dust motes float in beams of golden candlelight, and the faint sound of quill against parchment is amplified in the vast silence. The historian's breath is steady, but his pulse quickens with each discovery. Knowledge, he realizes, is both illumination and burden. Each revelation carries moral weight, each artifact a test of conscience. He opens a small coded journal, carefully deciphering the delicate script. The entries detail the deliberate concealment of the crown, decisions made to protect legacy, preserve hierarchy, and avoid scandal. Betrayals are chronicled alongside acts of courage, love entwined with duty, and moral compromises that shaped the monarchy's history. The historian reads with growing understanding. The crown is more than a symbol of power. It is a testament to the delicate balance between personal conscience and institutional loyalty. Hours pass in quiet study. Candlelight flickers, elongating shadows that merge with the historian's own. The vault seems to breathe, the air thick with accumulated memory, as if the palace itself is aware of each decision made under its roof. The historian's notes grow dense with observation. Every letter, every journal entry, every artifact is recorded, catalogued, and interpreted for meaning. The crown's rediscovery has initiated a chain of reflection that cannot be reversed. A subtle sound draws his attention, a faint shift in the stone floor outside the vault. He freezes, senses heightened. A guard, moving silently along the corridor, pauses and glances toward the vault. A silent reminder that observation in the palace is continuous, constant, and deliberate. The historian understands now that his work, though solitary, is under scrutiny, and that every decision carries consequences beyond immediate comprehension. He turns back to the journal, noting a particularly revealing passage, an act of destruction, a document burned in secrecy, a seal broken to preserve loyalty. These entries reveal the palace's moral calculus decisions, weighed between truth and survival, between personal conscience and institutional preservation. The historian feels the weight of centuries pressing upon him, understanding that the crown's rediscovery is only the beginning of moral and psychological reckoning. The camera pans upward, capturing the high marble ceilings where shadows of past caretakers seem to linger. The historian closes the journal, breath shallow but controlled, aware that the palace has tested him not through authority alone, but through its collection of secrets. Each artifact, each coded message, each historical note is a reminder that loyalty and conscience often conflict, and that moral courage is measured not in action alone, but in discernment and restraint. In the quiet, candlelit vault, the historian senses that the crown, though removed from view, continues to exert influence subtle, deliberate, morally resonant. The shadows stretch, merging with the architecture, the artifacts, and the accumulated history, creating a tapestry of memory, loyalty, and hidden truth. Every footstep in the marble halls now carries weight, every decision a moral pivot, as the palace continues its silent watch. A final, coded journal hints at secrets, yet fully revealed acts of betrayal, letters burned, and choices concealed for generations. The crown's rediscovery has unlocked corridors not only of stone, but of conscience, and the historian now stands at the threshold of decisions that will test loyalty, guilt, and the weight of institutional memory. What follows will force confrontation with hidden truths as shadows lengthen in the marble vaults, guiding him toward discoveries that cannot be unseen. The vault seemed to exhale as the historian opened the next journal, its leather cracked and worn from centuries of careful concealment. Candlelight trembled across the pages, illuminating words that were both confession and command, record and warning. Each entry unveiled layers of human complexity, choices weighed against duty, loyalty, and personal conscience. The crown, though physically absent, pulsed in memory like a heartbeat, its unseen presence weaving through the recorded histories. He read of forbidden correspondence between stewards and advisors, letters sealed and later burned to protect the monarchy from scandal. One entry detailed a betrayal born of ambition, a hand that had manipulated succession in secrecy, leaving the crown deliberately hidden. Another recounted a love that conflicted with duty, a clandestine choice preserved only in ink and shadow. The historian's pen hovered, then recorded, tracing the moral contours of decisions made in silence, centuries before his own observation. A faint sound startled him, the subtle click of a lock being tested in the corridor outside. He froze, the journal heavy in his hands. A guard, vigilant but cautious, passed the vault, unaware of the historian's presence, yet maintaining the palace's invisible watch. The moment underscored an unspoken truth. Knowledge here carries weight, and observation alone is never neutral. Every footstep, every sound is recorded by memory, habit, and moral scrutiny. He returned to the journal, deciphering coded passages that revealed the crown's concealment was deliberate, its discovery anticipated by those who had preserved it. One notation described a ritual act of secrecy. Documents destroyed, seals broken, keys hidden, actions taken to protect both crown and conscience. The historian felt the moral tension coalesce. The palace had not merely hidden a crown, it had preserved a delicate balance between truth and survival, justice and compromise. The candlelight flickered against a stack of charred papers, remnants of decisions deliberately erased from memory. The historian traced the edges, noting each fragment as testimony to actions that could never be undone. One particularly stark entry described the burning of a letter detailing the concealment of the crown, an irreversible act that forced those involved to live with consequences only history could judge. The moral weight of that choice hung in the air, tangible, as if the palace itself bore witness. Hours passed, each page read deepening the historian's understanding of the crown's significance. The vault seemed alive, shadows shifting across marble floors, reflections in polished stone casting subtle, almost sentient shapes. He realized that the rediscovery of the crown was more than an event, it was a moral crucible, forcing all who encountered it to confront loyalty, ambition, fear, and conscience. A sudden creak in the corridor drew his attention. Another minor breach, perhaps accidental, perhaps deliberate, had occurred. The historian's hand instinctively moved to steady himself, aware that the palace's silence is a language of authority and vigilance. Every decision here, every observation, carries potential consequence. The crown's presence, though hidden, commands attention, tests courage, and reflects the moral state of those who serve beneath it. He returned to a final journal, its pages more fragile than the rest, each word almost whispering in the dim light. It described a series of irreversible actions, a seal broken, a document burned, a promise made in shadows to preserve both crown and conscience. The historian's hand trembled as he transcribed the details, understanding that these acts had shaped the monarchy's history as much as victories, decrees, and ceremonies. Moral compromise had been embedded into tradition, and he now stood as both witness and participant. The weight of the discoveries pressed on him. The crown, once lost to memory, had become the center of moral, historical, and psychological reflection. Its rediscovery was no longer simply a matter of documentation, it was a challenge to conscience, an invitation to examine duty versus personal judgment. The palace, in its patient, deliberate way, had set him on a path that could not be undone. Finally, the historian closed the last journal, careful not to disturb the fragile integrity of its binding. Candlelight shimmered across the marble, shadows lengthening in a slow, deliberate dance. He exhaled quietly, the moral tension easing slightly, but never fully dissipating. The crown's secrets had revealed themselves in fragments, yet their implications would ripple outward, touching every act, every decision, and every allegiance within the palace. An irreversible act, a burned journal, a broken seal has revealed truths that cannot be undone. The historian now holds knowledge that challenges both duty and conscience, and the palace braces for the consequences. What follows will bring restoration, reconciliation, and reflection, as the crown is returned under careful custody. Yet its discovery reshapes understanding of history, loyalty, and moral responsibility. The palace corridors were calm now, yet the echoes of recent events lingered like a faint, persistent hum. Candlelight shimmered across polished marble, illuminating crests and inscriptions that had witnessed centuries of duty, ambition, and moral compromise. The crown, once lost to memory and rediscovered amid tension and intrigue, had been temporarily removed from view. Yet even in absence, it radiated significance, a reminder of the weight carried by those entrusted with both knowledge and responsibility. The historian moved carefully through the halls, notebook tucked under one arm, aware that the palace observed even in stillness. Each step was deliberate, a rhythm in sync with the measured heartbeat of tradition. Servants and stewards passed quietly, their movements disciplined, eyes lowered, maintaining both respect and distance. The air was heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that the palace had endured a subtle upheaval, and now, with ceremonial restoration approaching, every gesture, every breath mattered. In the central chamber, preparations were underway for the return of the crown to protective custody. Guards polished brass fittings, arranging ceremonial displays with meticulous precision. Stewards checked ledgers and inventories, ensuring that each protocol would be followed exactly. Even the smallest oversight could undermine the delicate equilibrium of authority and tradition that the crown's rediscovery had tested. The historian paused to observe. Candlelight danced across the polished marble floors, reflecting the careful choreography of centuries-old ritual. The crown, though still unseen by most, was central to this choreography. its symbolism shaping the actions, demeanor, and conscience of every attendant. He realized that its rediscovery had not only revealed hidden truths, but had also prompted reflection, personal, moral, and institutional, on the meaning of duty and loyalty. A senior steward approached, offering a measured nod. "The crown will be returned to its alcove shortly," he said, voice low but carrying authority. "Every precaution has been taken to honor both tradition and discretion. Your notes will guide future observation, but for now, the palace requires calm and ceremony." The historian nodded, aware that observation, even now, was a form of moral engagement. Knowledge without reflection is incomplete. Duty without conscience is hollow. The camera drifts through the chamber, capturing the quiet intensity of preparation. Guards adjust ceremonial cloths, polish ornamental fittings, and place the crown carefully on its protective stand. The historian observes the scene, noting how every gesture, a bowed head, a careful movement of hands, the alignment of ceremonial objects, embodies the palace's enduring values. The crown's rediscovery, though a disruption, has reaffirmed the importance of tradition, vigilance, and moral stewardship. Hours later, the crown is returned to its alcove. Its golden glow, though subdued, radiates with quiet dignity, illuminating the surrounding crests and ancestral inscriptions. The historian steps back, notebook in hand, feeling the weight of both relief and reverence. The palace has restored order, yet the moral and emotional lessons of rediscovery linger. Every decision taken, every protocol enforced, has strengthened the understanding that authority is inseparable from conscience. The Queen herself inspects the ceremonial restoration, her presence calm yet commanding. She nods to stewards and guards, signaling both approval and gratitude. The crown is restored. She says softly, not merely as an artifact, but as a reminder of our duty, our history, and the vigilance required to honor both. Her words resonate beyond the chamber, a subtle acknowledgement that the crown's rediscovery has reshaped understanding without compromising the continuity of tradition. The historian reflects quietly on the events that have unfolded. Discovery, tension, moral confrontation, and secret revelations have converged to illuminate both the fragility and resilience of institutional memory. The crown, hidden for centuries, has served not only as a symbol of authority, but as a test of conscience, a catalyst for reflection, and a bridge between past and present. He feels the subtle shift within himself from observer to participant, from chronicler to custodian of history and morality. In the quiet corridors following the ceremonial restoration, the palace exhales. Guards patrol with the same disciplined vigilance, stewards oversee inventories, and the historian takes note of subtle gestures, a ceremonial cloth folded just so, a ledger replaced with meticulous care, a guard's eyes lingering briefly on the alcove. These small acts, seemingly mundane, carry the weight of continuity and moral responsibility. Order has been gradually restored, and the crown has returned to protective custody. Yet its rediscovery has reshaped understanding of duty, loyalty, and conscience. The palace, calm but vigilant, prepares for reflection and reconciliation, as the historian begins to bridge the past and present, guiding the narrative toward quiet acknowledgement of courage, loyalty, and enduring legacy. The chamber was quiet now, the glow of the crown subdued yet persistent, radiating a gentle warmth that seemed to acknowledge the palace's restoration of order. Guards remained vigilant, but their movements were steady, measured, devoid of the tension that had gripped the halls for weeks. The historian lingered, notebook in hand, reflecting on the subtle orchestration of authority, loyalty, and moral responsibility that had brought them to this moment. Stewards moved with precise attention. adjusting ceremonial cloths, checking inventories, and ensuring that every protocol had been honored. Each gesture, no matter how small, seemed imbued with dignity, a reflection of centuries of tradition and careful stewardship. The crown, once lost to memory, now occupied its rightful place, yet its rediscovery had transformed the palace. What had been an object of pure symbolism had become a mirror for conscience, loyalty, and the delicate negotiation between curiosity and duty. The historian approached the alcove carefully, observing the crown from a distance. Its gold and jewels gleamed faintly, a testament not only to craftsmanship, but to resilience, the endurance of tradition, and the careful balance between power and moral obligation. He thought of the minor breaches, the coded journals, the irreversible acts of secrecy, and the confrontation with authority that had defined the past days. Each moment had carried consequence, each decision a test of conscience and courage. A senior steward approached, offering a quiet nod. "The crown is secured," he said. "All protocols have been reaffirmed, yet the rediscovery has reminded us that vigilance and conscience must coexist. The palace has endured, and so must our integrity." His words resonated deeply, underscoring the delicate equilibrium between duty, personal judgment, and institutional continuity. The Queen entered the chamber briefly, her presence calm yet commanding. She paused before the crown, her gaze lingering on the golden curves and intricate jewels. "This is more than restoration," she said softly. "It is recognition of courage, of discretion, and of the moral vigilance that preserves our history. Let every hand that touched this process remember the weight of service and the honor of conscience." Her words, though gentle, carried the authority of centuries, affirming the palace's moral and ceremonial order. The historian stepped back, feeling the quiet culmination of both discovery and reflection. He had moved from observer to custodian, from chronicler to participant in the palace's moral and historical narrative. Every journal entry transcribed, every ledger noted, every subtle observation had built a bridge between the past and the present. The crown's light, now subdued, was no longer merely physical. It illuminated understanding, responsibility, and moral courage. Hours passed in quiet acknowledgement. Guards and stewards conducted final inspections. Ceremonial protocols were reaffirmed, and the palace's rhythms returned to their measured cadence. The historian walked slowly through the halls, noting subtle gestures, a folded ceremonial cloth, a ledger replaced with care, a guard's steady gaze on the alcove. Each act reinforced continuity, respect, and the enduring weight of legacy. He paused before a portrait of a long-forgotten monarch, its painted eyes reflecting both authority and vigilance. In the quiet, he considered the personal courage required to uphold duty, the moral judgment necessary to navigate secrecy, and the delicate balance between curiosity and obedience. The crown had tested all of these, yet in its rediscovery it had also illuminated the enduring strength of conscience and tradition. As evening settled over the palace, the historian made his final notes. The crown, once hidden and now carefully restored, represented both continuity and revelation. Its rediscovery had reshaped understanding not through overt action, but through quiet reflection, adherence to protocol, and the moral courage of those who bore witness. The palace, resilient and dignified, had endured, and so too had the principles it preserved. Order has been restored, and the crown secured, yet its rediscovery leaves a subtle, enduring presence in the palace. The historian, once observer, now embodies the bridge between past and present, understanding the quiet courage and loyalty required to protect both legacy and conscience. Ahead lies reflection on the crown's enduring resonance, its whispers of history, power, and moral responsibility as the palace settles into calm vigilance. the palace had settled into a profound stillness. Corridors that once thrummed with the urgency of rediscovery now breathed quietly, their marble floors echoing only the soft steps of guards maintaining disciplined vigilance. Candlelight shimmered along the walls, reflecting subtly in the polished surfaces of ancestral portraits and gilded crests. The crown rested in its alcove, golden facets, subdued yet radiant, as if quietly acknowledging the restoration of order and the enduring weight of legacy. The historian moved slowly through the halls, notebook closed, observing rather than recording. His senses were attuned to the subtle rhythms of palace life, the soft rustle of ceremonial cloth, the distant echo of boots on marble, the faint hum of candles in their holders. Every sound, every shadow, seemed imbued with meaning. The crown's rediscovery had set events in motion, but now, in silence, it offered reflection and invitation to consider duty, loyalty, and the moral responsibility woven into the palace's history. He paused before the alcove. The crown, though still, seemed almost alive in its presence. Its golden light reflected softly on the surrounding crests, illuminating centuries of duty, loyalty, and moral judgment. The historian contemplated the subtle power of objects, how they carry memory, embody authority, and demand ethical reflection from those who encounter them. The crown was not merely ornament, it was conscience made visible, a symbol of choices made, sacrifices endured, and vigilance maintained across generations. The camera drifts slowly through the chamber, capturing quiet moments, a guard adjusting his stance, a steward folding ceremonial cloths, the historian's contemplative gaze resting on the crown. The palace, in its careful, measured way, had demonstrated that stability arises not only from rules and rituals, but from the moral integrity of those who enact them. Each act, each decision, is amplified across time, echoing through halls, records, and memories. Outside, corridors lay in serene darkness, yet the sense of observation remained subtle, continuous, and unbroken. The historian realized that the crown's whisper was not in sound but in presence, a reminder that power is inseparable from responsibility, that knowledge carries moral weight, and that history lives in both action and reflection. Every hand that had touched the crown, every document recorded or destroyed, every protocol enforced, was part of a larger moral narrative now quietly settling over the palace. He walked slowly to a portrait of a monarch long past, eyes painted with authority yet softened with reflection. In the silence, he thought of the countless decisions, compromises, sacrifices, and acts of courage that had preserved continuity and honor across centuries. The crown, though physically distant from the eyes of the public, served as both a symbol and a mirror, reflecting human ambition, ethical vigilance, and the quiet, often unseen sacrifices required to protect tradition. The historian rested a hand on the marble railing, allowing the stillness to wash over him. The palace, ancient and enduring, seemed to pulse with memory. The crown's golden facets whispered of continuity and moral responsibility, of choices that endure beyond individual lives, and of the delicate balance between power, conscience, and history. In that silence, the historian understood the subtle truth. Legacy is not merely inherited, it is maintained through vigilance, courage, and reflection. As night deepened, candlelight flickered against walls, elongating shadows and emphasizing the palace's grandeur and solemnity. The crown remained quietly radiant, a silent witness to past events, and a subtle guide for those entrusted with knowledge and duty. The historian, once observer and participant, now embraced the weight of conscience alongside authority, bridging past and present in contemplative acknowledgement of both responsibility and loyalty. The crown's whisper lingers, subtle yet persistent, echoing through corridors, conscience, and history. It invites reflection on moral duty, loyalty, and the fragile intersection of memory and authority. Tomorrow, the palace archives will reveal truths that even the crown dared not speak aloud, drawing observers into the delicate balance between secrecy and remembrance. Dawn filtered softly through the tall, arched windows, scattering pale light across the palace's marble floors. The corridors, once thick with urgency, now seemed suspended in calm, a silence charged with memory and moral reflection. The crown, resting in its alcove, glimmered faintly, not demanding attention but quietly asserting its presence. It was no longer merely an artifact. It had become a measure of conscience, vigilance, and the weight of human responsibility. The historian walked slowly through the halls, absorbing the stillness, letting each echo of his footsteps remind him of the palace's enduring rhythm. Each portrait, each coat of arms, seemed to whisper lessons of integrity, courage, and the delicate balance between duty and curiosity. The rediscovery of the crown had set events into motion, moments of tension, confrontation, and revelation, yet now, in reflective silence, its significance was deeper, subtler, and profoundly human. He paused before the alcove, allowing his gaze to linger on the golden facets of the crown. Light refracted softly, illuminating crests and inscriptions etched by generations of custodians. It was a quiet affirmation. Knowledge carries responsibility, and power is inseparable from moral conscience. The crown's whisper was not in sound, but in presence, in the gravity it imposed on those who observed, and in the ethical reflection it demanded. The historian reflected on the decisions he had witnessed, the minor breaches of protocol, the coded journals, and the irreversible acts, all threads in a tapestry of loyalty, moral compromise, and courage. Each action, each choice, had ripple effects across the palace, the monarchy, and the conscience of those entrusted with its preservation. The crown had illuminated not only history, but the enduring tension between personal judgment and institutional duty. In the quiet chamber, guards moved with subtle precision. Stewards carried out meticulous tasks, and the palace exhaled its centuries of memory into the still air. The historian felt a profound understanding take hold. The crown's rediscovery was a mirror reflecting ambition, fear, and ethical resolve alike. Its presence reminded him that legacy is both fragile and enduring, built not only through ceremonial acts, but through vigilance, discretion, and quiet courage. A soft breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying with it the faint scent of polished wood and ancient parchment. The historian allowed himself a final, meditative pause, absorbing the palace's serene, ordered rhythm. The crown, silent and unwavering, seemed to acknowledge that history and morality are inseparable, and that those who bear witness must do so with humility, integrity, and reflection. Every shadow in the corridors, every flicker of candlelight, every echo of the past contributed to a quiet, enduring truth. The crown is more than gold and jewels. It is a symbol of conscience, a measure of vigilance, and a whisper of history that endures beyond the span of individual lives. Its rediscovery had stirred curiosity, tension, and moral reckoning, yet in calm reflection. It also offered clarity, reconciliation, and the subtle illumination of understanding. The historian closed his eyes briefly, sensing the palace's quiet acknowledgement of past courage, present vigilance, and enduring duty. The crown's light, though subdued, continued to ripple across memory, authority, and conscience, reminding all who observed it that legacy is preserved not merely by law or protocol, but by the ethical discernment and quiet courage of those who serve. The crown's whisper lingers, subtle, eternal, bridging past and present. In its presence, the palace and those who serve it are reminded that history, duty, and conscience are intertwined. What remains hidden and what is remembered rests not in gold alone, but in the vigilance, courage, and quiet moral reflection of those entrusted with legacy. the palace endures, and so does the crown, a silent, luminous witness to human integrity across generations.